March 17, 1944. 1400 hours. The New Reich Chancellery, Berlin. The measuring tape whispered across fabric with the precision of a surgical instrument. Johann Weber's fingers, calloused from 40 years of tailoring, moved along the seam of the Führer's uniform jacket, noting the tension points, the places where threads strained against reality. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the private fitting room, catching dust motes that hung suspended in air thick with camphor and wool. Adolf Hitler stood on the raised platform, arms extended, staring at a point somewhere beyond the far wall. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. Weber preferred it that way. Silence meant he could work, could focus on the measurements that told stories the propaganda ministry would never allow to be printed. "The shoulders again, mein Führer," Weber said softly, reaching for his notebook. The leather-bound ledger sat open on the side table, pages filled with numbers that had become progressively more troubling over the past 18 months. He clicked his mechanical pencil, a gift from the propaganda ministry for 20 years of loyal service to the Reich, and made another notation. 42 centimeters across the back, down from 44 last October, down from 46 the year before that. Weber's assistant, a nervous young man named Franz, who'd been assigned to him by the SS, handed him the specialized corset they'd constructed after the last fitting. It wasn't called a corset, of course. The official documentation referred to it as an orthopedic postural support garment. But Weber had been making women's foundation garments since before Franz was born, and he knew a corset when he sewed one. The device was a masterwork of concealment, steel boning wrapped in soft leather with canvas panels that could be laced tight enough to force a collapsing spine into the rigid posture that newsreels demanded. Weber had spent 3 weeks perfecting the design, ensuring that no outline would show beneath the uniform jacket, that no bulge would betray its presence to the cameras that followed Hitler everywhere. "If you would permit me, mein Führer," Weber murmured, stepping forward with the garment. Hitler's eyes flickered toward him. Pale blue, rimmed with the yellowish tinge that Weber had noticed developing over the past year. The Führer nodded once, a sharp, irritated gesture. Weber helped him into the corset with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that speed meant less humiliation for his client. The laces ran up the back, and Weber pulled them tight, feeling the resistance, hearing the soft grunt of discomfort that Hitler couldn't quite suppress. Franz moved forward to help, but Weber waved him back. Some things required discretion beyond what even a trusted assistant should witness. When the laces were secured, Hitler's posture transformed. The stooped shoulders straightened. The forward lean, that slow collapse inward that Weber had been documenting for months, disappeared. The man on the platform suddenly looked like the man in the posters, the strong leader who promised victory even as the Eastern Front collapsed. But Weber could feel the truth beneath his hands, the tremor in Hitler's left arm that no amount of tailoring could hide. The way the Führer's weight had shifted, favoring his right side, creating uneven wear patterns in every uniform. The medication stains, small yellowish marks that appeared on shirt collars with increasing frequency, evidence of whatever Dr. Morell was injecting into his patient 8 times a day. Weber reached for the uniform jacket, a double-breasted affair in Feldgrau wool that he'd cut using measurements from 1939. Except the measurements from 1939 no longer applied. Nothing from 1939 applied anymore. The man who'd stood on this same platform 5 years ago had been broader, stronger, capable of standing for hours during rallies without the elaborate support systems that were now required. "The jacket fits too loosely in the chest," Hitler said suddenly, his voice hoarse. He'd been ranting at a military briefing until 3 in the morning. Franz had mentioned it when he'd arrived that morning. "You're making me look weak." Weber swallowed carefully. "The fit is precise to your current measurements, mein Führer. However, we can adjust the padding in the shoulders to create a more commanding silhouette." Hitler's jaw tightened. For a moment, Weber thought he might explode into one of the famous rages that had become more frequent, more unpredictable. But instead, the Führer simply nodded, his gaze returning to that distant point beyond the wall. Weber made another note in his ledger. Increase shoulder padding by 3 centimeters. Add additional chest panels. Reinforce lower back support. Consider double boning. The pencil scratched across paper, recording the physical decline of a dictator one measurement at a time. The truth was written in Weber's notebooks going back to 1938, when he'd first been summoned to work exclusively for the Führer. Back then, the measurements had been unremarkable. A man of average height and build, perhaps carrying a few extra kilograms around the waist, but nothing that required special accommodation. The uniforms had been straightforward, well cut, properly fitted, designed to project authority without theatrical exaggeration. But year by year, fitting by fitting, the numbers had told a different story. By 1941, Weber had begun adding extra padding to the shoulders to compensate for the increasingly pronounced stoop. By 1942, he was designing jackets with reinforced backing to help hold Hitler upright during long public appearances. By 1943, the first prototype of the corset had been commissioned, tested in secret, its existence known only to Weber, his most trusted seamstress, and presumably Dr. Morel. Now, in March of 1944, Weber was essentially building a framework of fabric and steel to prop up a collapsing structure. The spinal curvature had become so pronounced that without the corset, Hitler's head jutted forward like a vulture's, his shoulders rolling inward. The muscle wasting in his upper back and shoulders meant that uniform jackets hung like sacks unless carefully tailored with hidden padding. And the tremor, that damnable tremor in his left hand, required sleeves to be cut slightly longer, cuffs designed to hang in a way that concealed the constant shaking. Weber had seen this kind of physical deterioration before, though never in someone so relatively young. Hitler was only 54, yet his body was aging like a man 20 years older. The Tailor had an uncle who'd spent his final years in much the same condition, stooped, trembling, wasting away. But that uncle had been 78 and had spent his life working in the coal mines of Silesia. Hitler spent his days in the Führer bunker, pacing rooms, shouting at maps, and receiving Dr. Morel's injections. Those injections. Weber had overheard conversations, picked up fragments of information, the way any servant in a powerful household learns secrets. Morel was giving Hitler everything from vitamins to methamphetamine, from testosterone to a murky cocktail of substances that even other Nazi doctors had begun to question. The yellowish tinge around Hitler's eyes suggested liver problems. The tremor indicated neurological damage. The muscle wasting and spinal collapse spoke to a sedentary lifestyle combined with catastrophic medical mismanagement. "I need to be able to stand for 2 hours," Hitler said abruptly, breaking Weber's train of thought. "For the Berghof reception next month. 2 hours without sitting, without leaning. Can you do that?" Weber's hands paused on the fabric. 2 hours. With the current corset design, Hitler could manage perhaps 45 minutes before the pain became unbearable, before the compression of his organs made breathing difficult, before the strain on his already weakened muscles turned standing into agony. "It will require modifications to the support structure," Weber said carefully. "Perhaps a second brace for the lower back, integrated with the existing garment. And we should consider adding concealed padding to the trouser design to help distribute weight more evenly." Hitler's lip curled slightly. "Padding in my trousers? Like some theater actor?" "Like someone who understands that leadership requires endurance, mein Führer," Weber replied, keeping his voice neutral. "The modifications will be invisible, no one will know, but they will allow you to project strength for the duration required." It was the right answer. Hitler nodded, mollified, and returned his attention to the middle distance. Weber resumed his measurements, his fingers mapping the geography of decline. The waist had actually shrunk, down to 82 centimeters from 86 the previous year. Not from exercise or healthy eating, but from the appetite suppression caused by Morel's amphetamine injections. The chest had hollowed, the shoulders had narrowed, and the back had developed a curvature that Weber estimated at nearly 15 degrees from true vertical. Franz brought over the new trousers, and Weber helped Hitler step into them. These too had been specially modified, reinforced at the waist to help support the weight of the upper body bracing, with hidden elastic panels that allowed for easier breathing while maintaining a crisp military appearance. Weber had studied costume design manuals from the theater, learning techniques used to make aging actors appear younger and more vigorous on stage. Now he applied those same techniques to dressing a dictator. The transformation, when complete, was remarkable. Hitler stepped down from the platform and walked to the full-length mirror, and Weber watched his client's expression shift from irritation to something like satisfaction. The man in the mirror stood straight and tall, shoulders back, chest out. The uniform hung perfectly, projecting power and authority. The tremor in the left hand was concealed by the angle of the arm, the strategic placement of the cuff. The yellowing eyes were shadowed by the peak of the military cap that Weber had carefully positioned. "Better," Hitler murmured. "Much better." But Weber could see what the Führer apparently couldn't or wouldn't. The tightness around the eyes that spoke of pain. The way Hitler's breathing had already become slightly labored from the constriction of the corset. The minute adjustments of weight from foot to foot, seeking relief from the strain of forced uprightness. The man in the mirror looked strong, but the man inside the uniform was being slowly crushed by the very devices meant to support him. Weber returned to his notebook and began sketching the modifications that would be needed for the Berghof reception. A secondary lumbar brace, additional shoulder padding, perhaps a slight adjustment to the collar to better conceal the forward thrust of the neck. Each modification was another layer in an increasingly elaborate deception, another piece of engineering designed to make Hitler appear to be something he was no longer capable of being on his own. As he worked, Weber found himself thinking about the propaganda posters he saw plastered across Berlin. Hitler addressing rallies, arm outstretched in the famous salute, face set in determined lines. Hitler reviewing troops, standing ramrod straight among his generals. Hitler striding purposefully through the chancellery, the very picture of vigorous leadership. All lies, of course. Or rather, all carefully constructed illusions that required an army of assistants, tailors, photographers, doctors, handlers, to maintain. The fitting lasted another 30 minutes, during which Hitler said almost nothing. When it was finally over, when the uniform had been removed and the Führer had been helped back into his regular clothes, themselves specially modified though less dramatically, Hitler paused at the door. "The measurements," he said quietly, not quite looking at Weber. "They remain confidential. You understand this?" "Of course, mein Führer," Weber replied, "as always." Hitler nodded and left, flanked by 2 SS guards who'd been waiting outside. Franz immediately began gathering up the uniforms, preparing them for the seamstresses who would implement Weber's modifications. But Weber remained at his desk, looking down at his notebook, at the columns of numbers that charted the physical collapse of the Third Reich's leader. In the coming months, the modifications would become more extreme. By July, after the failed assassination attempt at the Wolf's Lair, Weber would be designing uniforms to conceal not just deteriorating posture but also injuries, a perforated eardrum, burns on the legs, the violent tremor that would spread to Hitler's entire left side. By December, the corset would need to be redesigned entirely, incorporating a rigid backplate that essentially turned Hitler into a man-shaped mannequin, held upright by engineering rather than muscles or spine. But all of that was still in the future. For now, on this March afternoon in 1944, Weber simply closed his notebook and locked it in the small safe he kept in the corner of the fitting room. The safe contained 5 years of measurements, 5 years of documentation showing exactly how the man who promised to lead Germany to a 1,000-year Reich was himself falling apart, 1 centimeter at a time. The official photographs from the Berghof reception in April would show Hitler standing confidently among his generals and staff, his posture impeccable, his presence commanding. The newsreels would capture him delivering a speech about ultimate victory, about the secret weapons that would turn the tide of war, about the strength and determination of the German people. And none of the millions who saw those images would know that their Führer could barely stand without a corset, could barely hold his head up without a network of hidden braces, could barely present the image of strength that his position demanded. Weber would continue his work throughout 1944 and into the chaotic final months of the war, constantly adjusting, constantly compensating, building ever more elaborate solutions to an increasingly unsolvable problem. His notebooks would become a chronicle of decline, a Tailor's eye view of how power and propaganda could create an image utterly divorced from reality. When Soviet forces finally overran Berlin in April 1945, Weber's shop was destroyed, his records scattered or burned. But some of the notebooks survived, discovered years later in the basement of a bombed-out building. Historians would study them, trying to piece together the medical history of a dictator from measurements and alterations, from notes about corsets and braces and the progressive modifications needed to keep a collapsing man standing upright. The propaganda had shown a strong leader. The newsreels had captured a vigorous commander. The posters had depicted an almost superhuman figure of authority and power. But Johann Weber's measuring tape had told the truth, that behind the carefully tailored uniform, beneath the custom-fitted corset and the hidden braces, Adolf Hitler was physically falling apart even as his empire crumbled around him. The master tailor had documented it all. One precise measurement at a time, creating a secret record of how even dictators cannot escape the constraints of their own failing bodies, no matter how many layers of fabric and steel you use to hold them upright.